The people who change your life the most are often the ones nobody notices at first. Emily Carter had become used to being invisible. At 34 years old, she spent most of her days moving quietly between responsibilities that never seemed to end. Every morning before sunrise, she prepared breakfast for her 9-year-old son Ryan, packed his lunch, and walked him to school before heading to her job at the local library. On weekends, she worked additional hours organizing inventory for a small community bookstore. Neither job paid very much, but together they kept a roof over their heads and food on the table. Most months were a careful balancing act. One unexpected expense could throw everything into chaos. Yet Emily rarely complained. She had learned long ago that worrying did not pay bills. Persistence did. Their apartment was small but clean. The furniture was mismatched, and the carpet showed signs of age, but it was filled with warmth. Ryan often said it was the happiest home among all his friends. Emily smiled every time he said it, even when she was exhausted. One chilly Tuesday afternoon, she arrived home carrying grocery bags and a growing list of concerns. The water heater had started making strange noises. Her car needed repairs. School supplies for Ryan would soon need replacing. She carefully reviewed her budget while preparing dinner and quickly realized there was very little room left for surprises. Later that evening, after Ryan finished his homework, he sat beside her at the kitchen table. "Mom," he said, holding up a school assignment, "what does successful mean?" Emily paused for a moment. "A lot of people think success means having a lot of money," she answered. "But I think it means being kind, honest, and never giving up when things get difficult." Ryan considered the answer seriously. "Then you are successful." Emily laughed softly, but his words stayed with her long after he went to bed. The next morning began like every other. She worked several hours at the library helping visitors find books, organizing shelves, and assisting children with reading programs. It was not glamorous work, but she loved it. Around lunchtime, her supervisor handed her a stack of mail that had arrived for employees. Most were ordinary letters. One envelope immediately stood out. It was heavier than the others and made from thick cream-colored paper. Emily frowned. She did not recognize the return address. Curious, she slipped it into her bag and continued working. Throughout the afternoon, she found herself wondering who might have sent it. She had no wealthy relatives, no business connections, no reason to receive formal correspondence. By the time she returned home, her curiosity had become impossible to ignore. Ryan watched from across the table as she carefully opened the envelope. Inside was an elegant invitation embossed with silver lettering. Emily read the first line once, then twice. Her eyes widened with confusion. The invitation was addressed specifically to her and requested her presence at the annual Brooks Foundation Gala, one of the most prestigious charitable events in the city. She stared at the card in disbelief. Ryan leaned forward. "What is it?" Emily looked at him, completely bewildered. "I think someone made a mistake." Yet as she examined the invitation more closely, she realized her full name had been professionally printed on every page. Whoever sent it clearly knew exactly who she was. Emily Carter spent the next 2 days trying to convince herself that the invitation had been mailed by mistake. Every time she looked at the elegant card, she felt more confused. The Brooks Foundation Gala was one of the most talked-about charity events in the city. Local newspapers covered it every year. Business leaders, philanthropists, and influential guests attended. People like Emily watched events like that from a distance, not from inside the ballroom. Yet the invitation remained on her kitchen table, addressed specifically to her. On Thursday evening, Ryan picked it up again and studied the silver lettering. "Maybe they want you to go because you did something important," he suggested. Emily smiled. "I appreciate your confidence, but I think you are giving me too much credit." Ryan shrugged. "You help people all the time." The comment stayed with her. At the library, Emily often organized reading programs for children. She helped elderly visitors locate books, stayed late to prepare community events, and volunteered whenever additional support was needed. She never considered those things extraordinary. They were simply part of who she was. The following afternoon, curiosity finally overcame hesitation. Emily called the phone number printed at the bottom of the invitation. After a brief introduction, a polite woman answered. "Brooks Foundation Events Office. How may I assist you?" Emily explained the situation and carefully asked whether an error had occurred. The woman placed her on hold for a moment before returning. "Miss Carter, I can confirm that the invitation was issued specifically for you. Emily blinked. You are certain? Absolutely. Your name appears on the guest list. Emily thanked her and ended the call, even more puzzled than before. That evening, she sat at the kitchen table examining her modest wardrobe. Most of her clothes were practical work attire. Nothing seemed appropriate for an upscale gala. She quietly closed the closet door and tried not to think about it. Over the next week, preparations for the event continued in the background of her daily routine. She worked at the library, helped Ryan with school projects, and managed household responsibilities. Yet the mysterious invitation never left her thoughts. Then, 3 days before the gala, another envelope arrived. Inside was additional information about the event, including the evening schedule. Emily scanned the pages casually until one detail immediately caught her attention. Near the center of the program appeared a list of special guests and honorees. She nearly dropped the paper when she saw her own name printed among them. Her heart began racing. There had to be some explanation. She read the line repeatedly, searching for clarification, but none appeared. Mom, Ryan asked from across the room. You look surprised. Emily slowly lowered the paper. I think I am. The night before the gala, she barely slept. Questions filled her mind. Why had she been invited? Why was her name included in the program? What possible connection could she have to an organization founded by billionaire Alexander Brooks? Saturday morning arrived with bright sunshine and growing uncertainty. Standing in front of the mirror, Emily carefully selected the best outfit she owned. It was simple, slightly outdated, and far less glamorous than what most guests would probably wear, but it was clean and neatly pressed. As she prepared to leave later that evening, she had no idea that the answers she had been searching for were already waiting inside the grand ballroom. As she prepared to leave later that evening, she had no idea that the answers she had been searching for were already waiting inside the grand ballroom. Emily Carter arrived at the hotel just before sunset. The building itself looked like something from a magazine, with towering glass windows, elegant lighting, and a steady stream of luxury vehicles arriving at the entrance. For a moment, she considered turning around and going home. She looked down at her modest outfit and immediately felt out of place. Around her, guests stepped out of expensive cars wearing designer gowns and tailored suits. Emily took a deep breath and reminded herself that the invitation was real. Her name was on the guest list. She belonged there, even if she did not fully understand why. Inside the lobby, everything felt larger than life. Crystal chandeliers sparkled overhead while soft music drifted through the air. Staff members welcomed arriving guests with practiced smiles. Emily approached the registration desk and nervously provided her name. The woman behind the counter checked a tablet, smiled warmly, and handed her a personalized badge. Welcome, Ms. Carter. We are delighted you could join us this evening. There was no hesitation, no confusion, no indication that a mistake had been made. Emily thanked her and entered the ballroom. The room was breathtaking. Hundreds of guests mingled beneath golden lights while servers moved gracefully between conversations. Large screens displayed images highlighting charitable projects supported by the Brooks Foundation. Emily quietly found a place near the back of the room and hoped to avoid drawing attention. Unfortunately, attention found her anyway. Several guests glanced in her direction before returning to their conversations. Most were polite, but a few expressions carried unmistakable judgment. Emily had seen those looks before. People often assumed things based on appearance alone. She tried not to let it bother her. Near one of the reception tables stood Victoria Langford, a well-known donor whose face frequently appeared in local business magazines. Victoria was speaking with several guests when her eyes briefly landed on Emily. The look lasted only a second, but Emily immediately sensed the evaluation taking place. Victoria leaned toward another guest and whispered something that caused a few people to glance her way. Emily looked down at her hands and focused on remaining calm. She reminded herself that she was there for a reason, even if she did not know what that reason was yet. As the evening continued, she noticed something even stranger. Several event staff members seemed to recognize her. A few greeted her by name. One even asked if she needed assistance finding her assigned seating area. Assigned seating. Emily had expected to sit wherever space was available. Instead, she discovered a reserved place card waiting at one of the tables near the front of the ballroom. Her heart began beating faster. The card displayed her name in elegant lettering alongside several prominent community leaders and donors. None of it made sense. While guests gradually took their seats, Emily studied the printed program once again. Her name still appeared among the special guests. This time she noticed something she had missed before. Beside her name was a small symbol that matched another symbol printed next to the keynote presentation scheduled later that evening. Before she could examine it further, the ballroom lights slowly dimmed. Conversations faded. Every eye turned toward the stage. Then an announcer stepped forward and introduced the founder of the organization. As applause filled the room, billionaire Alexander Brooks walked onto the stage and prepared to tell a story that would change Emily's life forever. As applause filled the room, billionaire Alexander Brooks walked onto the stage and prepared to tell a story that would change Emily's life forever. The audience welcomed him with enthusiastic applause. Alexander smiled, thanked everyone for attending, and began speaking about the mission of the Brooks Foundation. For several minutes, he discussed community programs, educational initiatives, and charitable partnerships. Emily listened politely, still trying to understand why she had been invited. Then the tone of his speech shifted. Alexander stepped away from the podium and spoke more personally. "Tonight," he said, "I would like to tell you about someone who changed my life many years ago." The room grew quiet. Emily noticed guests leaning forward in their chairs. Even Victoria Langford appeared interested. Alexander continued, "Before I built a successful company, before anyone knew my name, there was a period in my life when everything seemed uncertain. I was young, struggling, and carrying more responsibilities than I knew how to manage." Emily listened carefully. The story sounded sincere. "During that difficult time," Alexander said, "I met someone who helped me without expecting anything in return." Large screens beside the stage displayed photographs from years earlier. Some showed small community centers, neighborhood events, and volunteer projects. The audience watched attentively as Alexander described acts of generosity that had influenced his future decisions. "The person I am talking about never asked for recognition," he continued. "In fact, I am not sure she ever realized the impact she had." Emily felt a strange sense of familiarity as she listened, though she could not explain why. Around the ballroom, guests exchanged curious looks. Alexander paused for a moment before continuing. "What impressed me most was not what she gave. It was how she treated people. She believed every person deserved respect regardless of status, income, or appearance." Several audience members nodded. Emily glanced down at the program in her hands. Her name still appeared among the special guests, and now the mysterious symbol beside it seemed even more significant. On stage, Alexander began sharing specific memories. He described a community reading project that helped children from working families. He mentioned volunteers who spent extra hours supporting local programs despite having limited resources themselves. Emily's heart skipped a beat. The details sounded remarkably familiar. Years ago, before Ryan was born, she had volunteered at several literacy programs during college. Few people even remembered those projects anymore. Alexander continued speaking. One volunteer stood out. She showed up consistently. She encouraged children who doubted themselves. She believed small acts of kindness could create lasting change. Emily stared at the stage. Surely it was a coincidence. There had been dozens of volunteers. Hundreds, perhaps. Yet with each passing minute, the story seemed to move closer to her own experiences. Meanwhile, guests throughout the ballroom began quietly comparing notes. Some glanced toward Emily's table after noticing her name in the program. Others appeared confused. Victoria looked particularly skeptical. Then Alexander revealed another detail. "Several years later, when my first business struggled, I almost gave up. During that period, I found a handwritten note from that same volunteer. It contained a simple message about perseverance and service to others." Emily suddenly remembered writing encouragement cards for participants in a volunteer program long ago. She had forgotten all about them. The ballroom remained silent as Alexander carefully removed a small folded piece of paper from his jacket pocket. "I still carry that note with me today," he said. Emily felt her pulse quicken. For the first time all evening, she began to suspect that this story might somehow be connected to her. What she did not know was that the biggest revelation was still waiting just ahead. What she did not know was that the biggest revelation was still waiting just ahead. The ballroom remained completely silent as Alexander Brooks unfolded the small piece of paper he had carried for years. The note appeared worn from time and frequent handling. He smiled softly before reading a single sentence aloud. The people who make the biggest difference are often the ones nobody notices. The words hit Emily like a sudden wave. She remembered writing that exact phrase more than a decade earlier while volunteering at a literacy program. It had been part of a stack of encouragement cards prepared for participants and community members. She had never imagined anyone would keep one. Around the room, guests listened carefully while Alexander held the note in his hand. "I found this message during one of the most difficult periods of my life," he explained. "At the time, my company was struggling. I was questioning every decision I had made. This simple reminder changed my perspective." Emily stared at the stage in disbelief. Victoria Langford glanced toward her table, noticing her reaction. Other guests began doing the same. A quiet curiosity spread throughout the ballroom. Alexander continued speaking. "Many people assume success comes from intelligence, opportunity, or financial resources. Those things matter. But character matters more. The woman who wrote this note taught me that without ever realizing it." Emily felt increasingly uncomfortable as attention slowly shifted in her direction. She lowered her eyes and hoped the spotlight would move elsewhere. Instead, Alexander began revealing more details. He described the volunteer as someone who never sought recognition, someone who treated every child with patience and every person with dignity, someone who often stayed after events ended to help clean up and organize materials. Emily remembered those days clearly. She had been a college student balancing classes and part-time jobs. Helping at community programs had simply felt like the right thing to do. She never considered those moments important enough to be remembered years later. "For a long time," Alexander said, "I wanted to thank her properly. Unfortunately, life moved quickly. Careers changed. People relocated. Contact was lost." He paused and looked across the audience. "Several years ago, I began searching." The room grew even quieter. "At first, I only had a first name and a few records connected to old volunteer projects. It took a long time to find the person responsible for this note." Emily's heart pounded. She could feel dozens of eyes moving between her and the stage. Victoria's expression shifted from skepticism to confusion. Alexander smiled warmly. "Tonight, I finally have the opportunity to say thank you." A spotlight suddenly illuminated Emily's table. Gasps echoed throughout the ballroom. Emily froze. For a moment, she wondered if some mistake had occurred. Then Alexander looked directly at her. "Emily Carter," he said, "would you please stand?" The room seemed to stop. Emily slowly rose from her chair, her face flushed with embarrassment and surprise. Guests throughout the ballroom turned toward her. Many appeared shocked. Others looked puzzled. Several people who had quietly judged her earlier now stared in disbelief. Victoria sat completely speechless. Alexander waited for the room to settle before continuing. "This is the woman whose kindness influenced my life long before I ever became successful." Murmurs spread through the audience. Emily could hardly believe what was happening. She had arrived expecting answers. Instead, she had become the center of attention. Yet as overwhelming as the moment felt, Alexander was not finished. The story he was about to tell would reveal just how deeply their paths had been connected all along. Yet as overwhelming as the moment felt, Alexander was not finished. The story he was about to tell would reveal just how deeply their paths had been connected all along. Emily Carter remained standing as hundreds of guests watched her. She wished she could disappear into the background again, but that was no longer possible. Alexander Brooks stepped away from the podium and spoke directly to the audience. "Many years ago, before anyone associated my name with success, I was a college student struggling to stay enrolled in school." The large screens displayed photographs from that period of his life. The images showed modest classrooms, community projects, and volunteer events. "Most people only see the finished chapter of someone's story," Alexander continued. "They rarely see the difficult pages that came before it." The audience listened attentively. Even the servers moving through the ballroom paused to hear what came. Next, Alexander explained that during his final year of college, financial difficulties nearly forced him to abandon his education. He worked multiple jobs and often doubted whether he would achieve his goals. During that same period, he became involved in community literacy programs where volunteers helped children improve reading skills. One evening after a particularly discouraging week, Alexander said, I arrived at a volunteer event seriously considering whether I should quit school altogether. Emily vaguely remembered many volunteers from those years, but she still could not understand why he remembered her specifically. Then Alexander revealed the answer. That night, one volunteer noticed I seemed distracted. She spent 20 minutes encouraging a complete stranger she barely knew. Emily's eyes widened. A distant memory suddenly returned. She remembered speaking with a young volunteer coordinator who seemed discouraged and exhausted. She had offered simple advice and shared a few words of encouragement before returning to work. To her, it had been an ordinary conversation. She had forgotten it by the following week. She told me that difficult seasons do not define a person's future, Alexander said. She said that perseverance often matters more than talent. Most importantly, she reminded me that helping others gives meaning to success. The ballroom remained silent. That conversation changed my outlook. I stayed in school. I completed my degree. Years later, when challenges appeared again, I remembered those words. Emily felt overwhelmed. She had no memory of saying anything extraordinary. Yet Alexander clearly did. The note I showed earlier remained in my wallet for years, he continued. Whenever setbacks appeared, I reread it. Guests throughout the room glanced toward Emily with entirely different expressions now. The judgment she had felt earlier had disappeared. In its place was curiosity and respect. Victoria Langford looked particularly uncomfortable. She remembered the assumptions she had made only hours earlier based solely on Emily's appearance. Alexander smiled warmly. The reason Emily's name appears in tonight's program is because this year's Community Impact Recognition is dedicated to people whose quiet acts of kindness create lasting change. Applause began spreading through the ballroom. Emily felt tears forming in her eyes. She had never sought recognition. She certainly never expected to receive it in front of hundreds of influential people. Yet Alexander still had one final surprise waiting. He picked up a small folder from the podium. When our foundation searched for Emily, we discovered something remarkable. The audience grew quiet again. For more than 15 years, she has continued helping others through literacy programs, community projects, school activities, and volunteer work, all while raising her son alone and working multiple jobs. More applause followed. Emily shook her head in disbelief. She had never viewed those actions as remarkable. To her, they were simply the right thing to do. Then Alexander opened the folder and looked directly at her. And that is why tonight's highest honor belongs to Emily Carter. The room erupted with applause, but the greatest surprise of the evening was still moments away. The room erupted with applause, but the greatest surprise of the evening was still moments away. Emily Carter stood frozen beside her chair as hundreds of guests applauded. The sound seemed distant, almost unreal. She glanced around the ballroom and saw faces that only an hour earlier had barely noticed her. Now those same people were standing, smiling, and applauding her contributions to the community. Emily wished she could somehow explain that she was not extraordinary. She was simply a mother trying to do her best. Alexander Brooks raised his hand gently, and the applause gradually faded. There is one more reason I wanted Emily here tonight, he said. The audience settled back into their seats. Curiosity immediately returned to the room. Alexander opened the folder he had been holding and removed several photographs. Large images appeared on the screens behind him. The first showed children participating in literacy programs over the years. The second displayed volunteers helping families at community events. The third image caused Emily to gasp softly. It showed a much younger version of herself standing beside a group of children at a reading workshop nearly 15 years earlier. She had completely forgotten the photograph existed. When our team researched Emily's volunteer history, Alexander explained, we discovered a pattern. Every organization we contacted told us the same thing. More photographs appeared. Different locations. Different years. Different projects. Yet Emily was present in all of them. Whenever a community program needed help, she volunteered. Whenever a child needed encouragement, she showed up. Whenever families faced challenges, she found ways to contribute. Emily felt overwhelmed. She had never viewed those actions as achievements. To her, they were ordinary moments spread across many years. Yet seeing them collected together revealed something she had never noticed before. The audience watched attentively as the story unfolded. Several guests wiped tears from their eyes. Even Victoria Langford seemed deeply moved. Alexander smiled. The truth is that Emily represents exactly what our foundation exists to celebrate. Not wealth, not status, not influence. Service. Applause filled the room again. Then Alexander revealed the final photograph. This image was recent. It showed Emily reading with children at the local library where she currently worked. The audience immediately recognized her. Some people change the world from boardrooms, Alexander said. Others change it one person at a time. Emily felt tears forming. Throughout her life, she had often worried that her efforts were too small to matter. She worked hard, paid bills, raised Ryan, and helped where she could. Most days felt ordinary. Yet Alexander's words forced her to see those years differently. Then a staff member approached her table carrying a small plaque. The audience watched as Alexander stepped down from the stage and personally presented it to her. The inscription was simple: Community Impact Recognition, for quiet leadership and lasting kindness. Emily accepted it with trembling hands. "Thank you," she managed to say. Alexander smiled warmly. "No, Emily. Thank you." The ballroom responded with another standing ovation. This time it lasted much longer. As Emily looked across the room, she noticed something unexpected. Several guests were no longer focused on her clothing, her appearance, or her background. They were focused on her character. For the first time that evening, she felt completely comfortable. Yet the most meaningful moment of all was still waiting outside the ballroom. Someone very important was about to learn why his mother had become the center of attention at one of the most prestigious events in the city. Someone very important was about to learn why his mother had become the center of attention at one of the most prestigious events in the city. After the ceremony concluded, guests slowly gathered around Emily Carter. Throughout the evening, she had expected to remain unnoticed. Instead, she now found herself surrounded by community leaders, business owners, and donors eager to introduce themselves. Many thanked her for the work she had done over the years. Others shared stories about volunteer programs she had supported. Emily accepted their kind words graciously, though she still felt overwhelmed by everything that had happened. Across the room, Victoria Langford approached cautiously. Earlier in the evening, she had been among those who quietly judged Emily based on appearance alone. Now her expression carried genuine regret. "Ms. Carter," she said softly, "I owe you an apology." Emily looked surprised. Victoria continued, "I made assumptions before I knew anything about you. Tonight reminded me how wrong that can be." Emily smiled kindly. "We all make mistakes sometimes." Victoria seemed relieved by the response. The conversation lasted only a few minutes, but it represented something important. No arguments, no humiliation, no revenge, simply understanding. As the evening progressed, Alexander Brooks introduced Emily to several Foundation board members. They spoke about community programs, literacy initiatives, and future opportunities to support local families. Emily was honored by their interest, but her thoughts kept returning to Ryan. She could not wait to tell him what had happened. Shortly before leaving, Alexander asked if he could speak with her privately. They stepped onto a quiet terrace overlooking the city skyline. Lights stretched across the horizon while cool evening air drifted through the space. "I am glad you came tonight," Alexander said. Emily laughed softly. "I almost stayed home. That would have been unfortunate." For a moment they both smiled. Then Alexander became more serious. "There is something else I want you to know." Emily listened carefully. Alexander explained that the Brooks Foundation planned to expand several educational programs over the next few years. Part of that effort involved creating a community advisory council composed of people with direct experience helping families and children. "We would like you to join that council," he said. Emily stared at him in surprise. "Me? Absolutely." She shook her head. "I'm not qualified for something like that." Alexander smiled. "That is exactly what someone qualified would say." Emily laughed despite herself. The offer felt unbelievable. Yet the more they discussed it, the more she realized it aligned perfectly with the values she had followed throughout her life. Helping others had never been about recognition. It had always been about making a difference where she could. Later that night, Emily finally returned home. The apartment lights were still on. Ryan had been waiting. The moment she stepped through the door, he rushed toward her. "How was it?" he asked excitedly. Emily looked at her son and smiled. Then she handed him the recognition plaque. Ryan's eyes widened. "Mom, is this yours?" Emily nodded. He read the inscription carefully before looking back up at her. I told you that you were successful." Tears filled Emily's eyes. Out of everything that had happened that evening, those words meant the most. She hugged him tightly and realized something important. The recognition, the applause, and the admiration were wonderful. But the greatest reward was knowing that her son had already understood her value long before anyone else did. And what neither of them realized yet was that the impact of this remarkable evening was only beginning. And what neither of them realized yet was that the impact of this remarkable evening was only beginning. In the months that followed, life did not suddenly become perfect for Emily Carter. She still woke up early each morning. She still worked at the library. She still packed lunches for Ryan and managed a busy schedule filled with responsibilities. Yet something important had changed. For the first time in many years, she no longer felt invisible. The recognition from the Brooks Foundation opened doors she never expected. As a member of the Community Advisory Council, Emily began working alongside educators, nonprofit leaders, and local organizations to improve literacy programs throughout the region. Her practical experience proved valuable. Unlike many people discussing community issues from a distance, Emily understood the challenges families faced because she lived them every day. Alexander Brooks remained a trusted supporter and friend. He often invited Emily to planning meetings and asked for her perspective before major initiatives were launched. To his credit, he never treated her like a symbol or publicity story. He respected her judgment. Over time, others did as well. One afternoon, several months after the gala, Emily attended the opening of a new reading center funded by the foundation. Families filled the building. Children explored bookshelves. Volunteers organized activities. As Emily walked through the center, she noticed a plaque mounted near the entrance. Curious, she stepped closer. The inscription thanked community members whose dedication had inspired the project. Among several names was her own. Emily stared at it in disbelief. She still struggled to see herself the way others apparently did. Later that evening, she and Ryan visited the center together. Ryan proudly showed his friends the plaque. "That is my mom," he announced. Emily laughed and gently shook her head, but she could not hide her smile. Watching her son beam with pride meant more than any public recognition ever could. Meanwhile, the lesson learned at the gala continued affecting others as well. Victoria Langford became one of the reading center's strongest supporters. She often spoke publicly about the importance of looking beyond appearances and recognizing character. Several guests who had attended the event shared similar reflections. The evening had challenged assumptions many people did not realize they were carrying. 1 year later, the Brooks Foundation hosted another gala. This time, Emily attended without uncertainty. She wore a simple dress, just as she always preferred. Yet nothing about her confidence depended on clothing anymore. She understood something she had not fully realized before. A person's value is not determined by how much money they have, where they sit in a ballroom, or what others assume when they first walk into a room. It is determined by how they treat people when nobody is watching. During the event, Alexander gave a brief speech and shared a photograph from the previous year's ceremony. The image showed Emily standing beside him while the audience applauded. "This picture reminds us of an important truth," he told the crowd. "Some of the most extraordinary people live ordinary lives. Their impact cannot be measured by titles or wealth. It is measured by the lives they touch." Emily looked around the ballroom and noticed something remarkable. Nobody was focused on appearances anymore. Nobody cared about old clothes or social status. They were listening to a story about kindness, perseverance, and character, the same values she had tried to teach Ryan for years. As the evening came to an end, Emily stepped outside and looked at the city lights stretching across the horizon. She thought about the invitation that had arrived unexpectedly months earlier.